Hello, it's Gabriel, and I'm back. Volume 16 of this education series. Fire's about to get going. This is going to be one of those gradient lighting situations. So, we are talking tonight about the education system, but I've actually already talked a lot about it. Thisbe and Richard Grove and Socrates and John Locke and a lot of other people. So I'm actually not just starting to talk about it. I've really been talking about it for a while, but I'm going to try to be getting into more educational system, the idea is just, okay, you have all this information about the education system that can ideally help you manage it, help you manage making choices. So tonight I'm going to be talking more about some of those choices in the past, kind of what opportunities have existed prior to now and why those opportunities have looked the way they've looked. So yeah, here we go. Knowledge. Because a lot of people say knowledge is power, and great power comes great responsibility. So anyone who understands the, kind of gatekeepers in knowledge will certainly be very powerful. So maybe that's a good place to start. Just what is a gatekeeper? So a gatekeeper is just the idea that in society, constraints limit the amount of people who have various opportunities, and that then gatekeepers constrain who gets what opportunities, and they can do that in a way that is sometimes not in the interest of the public. And a great example of a gatekeeper is just a coach who has to pick a team. And they don't always pick the best team, but they will try to do that ideally. And also, sometimes it's you're picking role players. There's a lot of different rationale you can give for picking various people or letting them through the gate. And nepotism is frequently one in education that we see. And if you think of sports as being an educational tool, then, there you go. Nepotism frequently plays a part in those gatekeeping decisions. All right, fire. All right, so talking about gatekeepers. Okay, so our goal in understanding the education system, just like in understanding anything, should be to ask the right questions, and then through a line of questioning to come to a greater understanding of what we're talking about. So, in this case, we're trying to understand the education system. So, what does our education system consist of? So, teachers are going to be one main component. Students are going to be another main component, because you can learn from children. That's a big part of parenting, and students can also learn from other students, and even teachers can learn from students sometimes. So our education system consists of teachers, parents, and then you also have administrators, and you have finance people, and depending on how large the system is, you could have other regulators, or you could have royal powers, as we're going to talk about later. So we do have an education system that has a lot of components to it. Tonight we're going to kind of take a look back in time to when education was a little bit simpler, because that actually can make it a little bit easier to understand our education system today. And I've already talked about kind of some of the components that are very important in today's education system, like standardized testing and the way that's tied into teachers' pay and federal regulations. But those things are actually relatively new. The federal government did not interfere in education for the majority of our country's history. So that is a feature of our modern education system that is actually relatively new. So, one man I have written about or talked about, or I think I've talked about him, is a man named Sam Houston. And he's the founder of Texas, or the first governor of Texas. Won a battle against Santa Anna, so shout out shout out to him for that. And Santa Anna said he was the Napoleon of Mexico. So if you look at Napoleon's ties to the Illuminati, that's a good thing. Anyone who's winning battles against those people wearing the red shoes, that's not such a bad thing. Anyway, Sam Houston, when he was at the age of 18, was a debtor. He was poorly educated himself, but that didn't stop him from seeking to pay his debts by becoming a schoolmaster. And he taught a variety of ages, because at that time, there weren't that many people. He was living in Tennessee, and he was teaching, just a variety of things, including he actually was raised by Native Americans, so he probably even had some awesome native knowledge that he employed. So he taught at this schoolhouse in Tennessee in order to pay his debts just prior to the War of 1812, and then he enlisted in the military. But for 1 year, Sam Houston was a teacher in Tennessee. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about schools were not the most selective employers, and women didn't really work that much. Women would often spin fabric materials or cotton into cloth. I don't really know the name for that, but spinning wheels were a big part of women's employment. And what else? Anyway, schools were one of the common places for women to work, and they weren't as selective about who could work there. So Sam Houston, despite not being educated, was capable of teaching, and something tells me he was a good teacher. So school ran from the spring to the fall, interestingly, not like it is today. It began after the crops were planted and ended, once the weather got too cold for people to continue attending school. Because I think in colonial America, survival was kind of a bigger priority, or not survival, but just the day-to-day living activities became a bigger priority during winter. So whereas we have more free time in the summer, I think most people had more free time during winter in colonial America. So the cost was $8 to attend school at Sam Houston's schoolhouse. And it was actually built before, he was built before he got there. And it's just a wood, log cabin kind of thing. It's termed a field school. And he wasn't really in charge of it, but he taught there. And so the cost was $8. Sorry, anyway, the cost was $8. The tuition was partially paid in corn and cloth called calico, and cash as well. But there was a shortage of cash because of the transfer of, as I've talked about, the transfer of hard currency to the eastern seaboard banks, and then overseas, because those banks were all run by the British. Yay. So, tuition was paid in a variety of ways. So yeah, Sam Houston only taught there for about a year, so it's not a great example. It's just an interesting idea that book learning. They did a lot of, they did a variety of educational tasks. Anyway, he repaid his debts and then joined the army, which also paid. So just an interesting example. The schoolhouse is actually still open today, and yeah, they have a museum and a bunch of other stuff. So one of the oldest schools in the United States is Harvard University, which was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was chartered as which was established by the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was chartered by the Crown. So the Crown of England has their hands in many aspects of the United States' history. Education, certainly one of them, because as we'll talk about in a little bit, there's been kind of a constant desire to control information, and education is a great way to do that. So the Massachusetts Bay Company was a big part of the Puritan Great Migration, and the Puritans viewed New England as the New Jerusalem foretold by Yeshua when he said, I'm going to find or establish a place for us to be together, for my Father's house has many rooms, something like that. And so their leader, John Winthrop, said, we will be as a city upon a hill, because he believed that in New England, that, the Connecticut River would be like the river of life, and then they would be watched by the whole world. The whole world's eyes will be upon us, and we will be as a city upon a hill. And that's what he said, because he firmly believed that the prophecies of Yeshua were going to come true, along with other biblical prophecies of the end times. So this Massachusetts Bay Company is chartered, and then they start a school, and that school is what will eventually become Harvard University. So interestingly enough, the first leader of Harvard University was a man named John Eaton, I believe, or something Eaton, who was a Jesuit. So, as I've talked about numerous times, the Jesuits in New France were having conflicts with the Puritans. The Jesuits in Virginia were having conflicts with the Puritans. The Jesuits were the only people who did not come, who were never seen from again after Bacon's Rebellion. And so, yeah, there's this constant tension between Puritans and Jesuits, where the Jesuits claim to want to promote Jesus is, it's like an order of Jesus or something. I don't really know. Anyway, Jesuits claim to want to promote Jesus's goals. The Puritans believe in a pure interpretation of the Bible and are obviously a very religious group. That's what they're known for. That's why they're called Puritans. So you would think they would get along, but they don't, because the Jesuits are not really. If you look at the Jesuits, controlling the Vatican, and the Vatican's roots in the Egyptian priest brotherhood, that obviously predates Jesus. I think it's pretty clear, or you can determine for yourself kind of who you think is on which side. So a lot of our printing and media press is owned by the City of London, and as I've said previously, I believe that's the new Babylon, and they kind of hate on John Winthrop. So I kind of tend to trust John Winthrop a great deal. I also think that he is the reincarnation of Gary Wayne, or Gary Wayne's a reincarnation of John Winthrop, but that's just a belief. You don't have to, you don't have to take me on my word. You don't have to believe that. Anyway, there's a few Puritans who resemble modern day people like Gary Wayne and Hal Lindsley, but you don't have to take my word on that. That's just an interesting idea. So, John Winthrop and John Eaton, or Gary Eaton, or whatever this Eaton guy is who's the first president of Harvard, they get in a little bit of a tussle because it turns out Mr. Eaton is beating his students and his wife is feeding them goat dung. And I mean, I don't know what we should expect from the Jesuits, but anyway, there's a trial, he's found guilty, and then the church tries to step in and get a retrial, and maybe not. Anyway, Wikipedia says the church tries to step in and get him acquitted or something, or maybe a retrial, and John Winthrop says, nope, enough evidence was presented, he's guilty, get out of here. And then John Winthrop also accuses him of stealing some money before he leaves and goes to Virginia. And we all know that the Jesuits are in Virginia too, and anyway. So, this dude, Eaton, who was educated at a chartered school by the Crown and has ties to the Church of England, he leaves, and a different man named John Harvard comes in. And it's interesting because they say Harvard was initially established to train Puritan ministers, but then why are you picking a Jesuit to run that school? So it's hard to really believe that the original intention of Harvard was training Puritan ministers, especially if, it's hard for me to believe that. I don't know, you can believe what you want, but... So, Harvard has this kind of weird founding, this weird dude is involved with it. His entire family had just died in the Black Plague, but they were extremely wealthy in England. They had multiple houses, they had a business, and since many businesses were chartered by the Crown and it was hard to trade without having the approval of the Crown, typically those people are associated with the Crown as well. People who, have businesses and stuff like that. So that was in the early 1600s, and if you look at Cambridge, Cambridge lies along a ley line, which is a line that connects Washington, D.C. to Stonehenge, and along that line are many cities, including Philadelphia and Baltimore. Cambridge is one of them, and it goes all the way to the first British colony in Newfoundland, and along those lines there's magnetic anomalies, as if there's an electrical current running underground, as if there's some underground transportation systems. Anyway, the magnetic anomaly is not the most interesting thing here about Cambridge. We're talking about schools, so I think you guys can get a clear picture pretty much of what I'm trying to say here. Cambridge has ties to Jesuits from the very beginning, and so does George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which is the school that employs one of the Brett Kavanaugh accusers, and her lawyer is the same lawyer as some of the FBI people, not Peter Strzok, but Carter Page, I think. No, not Carter Page. McCabe. McCabe's lawyer is the same as, what's her name? I don't remember. She's a professor at George Washington, and that's where Bill Clinton went. That's where Carroll Quigley worked, and Carroll Quigley had access to the Council of Foreign Relations, their records, and that's how he wrote Tragedy and Hope, which is an account of kind of how all this crazy secret societies have run things. But you don't need to know all that to know that Harvard University has some questionable things about it. And from the very beginning, they tried to re-educate natives there, which is like a foretelling of what would happen later on, where Native Americans would be schooled to a large extent in schools that were formed by the government, or by the federal government. I don't really know a ton about that, but... Alright. So, Harvard was where the first printing press was in the United States. So just keep that in mind, that even if you might not think that there's a new Babylon controlling your media in the United States, from the inception of the United States, the Jesuits controlled the press, initially, at least. And that's probably why a free press was so important to the founders of our country, is because they understood that the royal powers and the Jesuits were going to try to manufacture the information that was available. And, one of the first things they were printing on that printing press was a Bible. And obviously I've talked already about the issues with the Bible. If you want to learn more about that, Revelation 10:7, translations, Elohim is a plural word. That's all I got to say about that. All right, so I kind of skipped around, so I just got to find what I haven't touched on here. All right, so I think that's most of what I want to talk about school. So you could, again, so my point here is I'm trying to contrast things. So it's like we typically think of these elite institutions as serving the students better than kind of like a field house. But if it's me, I'd rather have Sam Houston be my, schoolmaster than a Jesuit, because I don't trust Jesuits. And you can trust them. Personally, I don't. So there's a history of our education system that relates back to the crown. And there's another great example of that, which are the Baldwin family, actually. So there's a marriage recently between Justin Bieber and the Baldwin family, and I was like, that's pretty weird. I wonder what their history is, because, they refuse to talk about their father. It's very odd. It's like they don't say anything about him. I mean, anyway. So if you go back through their family history, you can see that there are British military officers who were among their ancestors, and they're also part of a family that founded Yale, Williams College, I believe Dartmouth as well, but certainly Yale and Williams College. So a family that produced a great deal of educational institutions. And then they, go on to produce, movie stars and I'm sure other people that I just don't know. And they're also associated with the British military, which serves the crown. So it's just another example of, how our educational institutions are associated with royal interests, and, it could all be coincidence, but it's really unlikely that this one specific family that the Baldwins originate from, and guess where they used to live, that family is in New London, Connecticut. So, that's kind of a disclosure in my view that they're living and supporting the initiative or the interests of New Babylon. And I could be wrong, but it sure seems that way. So, that's kind of how Yale and Williams College and Amherst College and Williams College are very connected. Amherst College and Williams College were the two colleges that were vying for the first land-grant institution in Massachusetts. Ended up going to Amherst. But the fact that it could have gone to either one kind of implies that they're connected and they're both very powerful. And obviously Yale is a tremendously powerful institution. Like George Bush and John Kerry both attended Yale University, and they were both part of the same Skull and Bones fraternity, which is that fraternity is described by Art Thompson as having played a major role in the instigation of the Civil War. And it still exists today, except they kind of have shifted into other. They kind of know their cover's blown, so they've kind of moved into a few other names for it. But Yale is still Yale. It's still very Gothic architecture. And Gothic architecture, like that we think of being associated with churches, actually predates the church. And you can see examples of it in Roman times, and it's depicted in art all over the place. So anyway, I'm pretty sure it's a disclosure when you see buildings like that, that those are not, that's kind of not a dangerous place to be. I mean, I've been there. I know some people who went there. I visited. It was interesting. Obviously, at the time I felt like it was an honor. Now I kind of think it's more of something else. But so yeah, Yale's a pretty crazy place. Someone said that the CIA is like a Yale alumni club. So depending on how you view the CIA, the CIA was established right after Roswell, along with Majestic 12, and they were supposed to not do any domestic activities, but they do. And the clearest example of that is that Alan Dulles was the person in charge of the panel that investigated the murder of JFK. After Mr. Dulles was removed from the CIA by JFK. So, and then JFK said he was going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces. And the CIA right now is going through... The CIA is done, according to Q. And we're going to talk about Q soon. So, I think one of the things I'm going to try to do is not just talk about the issues with our education system like I have kind of previously, but I'm trying to still work in some of the positive examples of education and educators, like Sam Houston, or, others that I can come across, John Locke. So, how far back does that conflict go between, the Jesuits and the Puritans, or the Crown and the Free Press, or, these various conflicts over information? It goes back pretty far. So, like Socrates said that the education system was a way of instilling patriotism in students, and it's not like real patriotism, it's more like a kind of a propaganda. And, if Richard Grove, I agree with Richard Grove that public schools are a form of brainwashing, and I think that's kind of part of the reason is that if you are in power, you have an incentive to manipulate the education system so that people are less informed about what you're doing, and that way you're less accountable. And also, if they're less informed about the past, they're not as likely to question your actions. So that's kind of why we see such a battle over education constantly taking place. One last thing I'm just going to close with here, because I'm not going to make another 40-minute video tonight, is a school is typically thought of in terms of thought. So it's typically thought of like as a school of thought. So one school of thought is like a Taoist school of thought, where your karma or your feng shui or whatever the Eastern philosophy that's associated with Taoism that I don't really understand very well. I think Tao also has to do with like how you present yourself. But anyway, so what is a school of thought? So it's like a group of teachers that all have a similar view of a specific way of presenting the truth, and a specific most compelling truth that is worth emphasizing to students. And that's like kind of vague, but I think most people know what a school of thought is. I don't think that's like really the thing I need to harp on here. What I'm really trying to get at, though, is so a thought may or may not occur in the brain. Like Graham Hancock says, thoughts may not occur in the brain. I kind of agree with him that we have more thoughts, I think, that can fit in our brain. We know more than I think can fit in our brain with the synapses we have. And the idea that, a dream can portend the future implies that that thought is coming from somewhere else. And then if you start understanding past life regressions and stuff like that, or any kind of hypnotic regression, that's an idea that thoughts are not exactly always accessible. So, I don't know. For me, it's pretty clear that thought is outside of the brain, and that the brain is like an antenna, and that's what Graham Hancock and Joe Rogan think too, that our brains are like a receiver, that it's a vessel of consciousness, that the sensory input is like a catalyst. That's what the law of one says. And then we have thought in response to that catalyst. So, if that's true, then it's a very interesting idea, and it presents a very interesting idea also about an angel, because the Bible says, be careful if you are hosting someone, because they could be an angel and you could not know it. And it's just an interesting idea that you can be interacting with someone and they can be potentially different than you understand them to be. And it could potentially be a negative form of an angel, because we have like fallen angels, and where have they fallen from? The heavens, and what does that imply? It implies some kind of extraterrestrial falling down, and that rebellion against God implies that they're negative. So why would a negative extraterrestrial be interacting with you, if not, in my opinion, to influence your thoughts? And certainly from the interactions I've had with people who seem like negative extraterrestrials, or shapeshifters, or seraphim, or Nephilim, there's a lot of words for it. I do think their goal is to influence your thought. And I do think that, they talk a lot about it in the Law of One, and other places, like psychic attack is a real thing. There are forms of like dark magic that a lot of people practice, and love ultimately trumps all of it. So it's not that it's like, the Bible also says there's nothing that you will suffer that you can't bear. I just think it's a really interesting idea that your education is intended to provide thoughts that, if you remember, allow you to improve your future in some way. So as much as it's worth really understanding our education system, like, we really haven't really talked about how we and our vessels interact with thought, and then that interaction goes to the spirit or the soul, and then how that kind of plays out. So, just wanted to end on that note, little metaphysical, spiritual idea. So yeah, hope you enjoy, or hope you got something out of this. We'll see ya.